Can you remember your musical taste back when you were 15? Probably you listened to music from High School Musical or Hannah Montana or probably Glee. Well, if you prefer more angsty music back then, you probably were into My Chemical Romance or Fallout Boy. Now, the question is, do you still listen to the same music you did back then? While some of you might say yes, I bet a large portion of you no longer listen to the same music you did when you were 15 years old. In fact, I know that some of you find their past musical preference a bit cringy. Now, development refers to long-term personal changes that have multiple sources and multiple effects. It's like the difference between your musical taste at age 15 compared to your jam right now, rather than the difference between your music 1 week and your music the next week. So, some human developments are especially broad and take years to unfold fully. A person's ever evolving ability to read other person's mood, for example, may take a lifetime to develop fully. Other developments are faster and more focused, like a person's increasing skill at solving crossword puzzles. Now, the faster and simpler is the change, the more likely are we going to call that change learning, which we have talked about last week, instead of development, which is the topic this week. So, the difference between learning and development is a matter of degree if you think about it. When a child learns to name the planets of the solar system, for example, the child may not need a lot of time, nor does the learning involve a multitude of experiences. So it's probably better to think of that particular experience, learning to name the planet, as an example of learning rather than of development. So in this two-part video lesson, we will discuss development in four major domains. In the first video, we will talk about physical development. We begin by describing the physical changes that typically happen to children across the school years, changes in size, the effect of puberty, the growth of motor skills, and health trends across childhood and adolescence. Physical development is not a central concern for most teachers, but as we point out, or as we are going to point out today, it does affect students' school experiences indirectly. And as the saying goes, anything psychological is at the same time physiological. We then move to cognitive development, and specifically to the cognitive theory of Jean Piaget, which we have talked about last week, whose ideas have influenced many educators around the world. Now, in the second part of this lesson, in the second video that is, we will talk about social development, with attention especially to theories of Erik Erikson and that of Abraham Maslow. Lastly, we will talk more about, we will talk about moral development, a domain that spans both cognitive and social development to bring all these concepts together. We will look in particular at the theoretical frameworks of Lawrence Kohlberg and that of Carol Gilligan. And we will end with a suggestion for how these ideas can be translated into useful strategies for encouraging the moral development of students. So, students' development matter for teachers, but the way it matters depend partly on how schooling is organized. In teaching a single self-contained grade level, the benefits of knowing about development will be less explicit, but just as real. As you teach many grade levels, working exclusively with a single grade, like say, third grade classroom, for example, highlights differences among students that happen in spite of their similar ages, and obscure similarities that happen because of having similar ages. Under these conditions, it is easy to notice students' diversity, but harder to know how much of it comes from differences in long-term development compared to differences in short-term experiences. Knowledge about long-term changes is still useful, however, in planning appropriate activities and in holding appropriate expectations about students. What changes in students can you expect relatively soon simply from your current program of activities and with ones may take a year or more to show up? This is a question the developmental psychology can help you to answer. If you teach multiple grade levels, as often is true of college professors or teachers in middle school or even in high school, then you need to, rather your need for developmental knowledge will be more obvious because you will need to confront wide age differences on a daily basis. As a physical education teacher, for example, you may teach kindergarten children at one time during your day, but sixth graders at another time, or teach seventh grader at one time, but 12th graders at another. Students will differ more obviously because of age, in addition to differing because of other factors like their skills or knowledge learned recently. Nonetheless, the instructional challenges will be the same as the ones faced by teachers of single grade classes. You will want to know what activities and expectations are appropriate for your students. To answer this question, you will need to know something not only about how your students are unique, but also about general trends of development during childhood and adolescence. Note that developmental trends vary in two important ways. The first, as indicated earlier, is in their generality. Some theories or models of development boldly asserts that certain changes happen to virtually every person on the planet and often at relatively predictable points of life. For example, a theory might assert that virtually every toddler acquires a spoken language or that every teenager forms a sense of personal identity and will rebel against their parents. Individuals who do not experience these developments would be rare, though not necessarily abnormal as a result. Other theories propose developmental changes that are more limited, claiming only that the changes happen to some people or only under certain conditions. Developing a feminine gender role, for example, does not happen to everyone, but only to the females in a given population, and the details vary according to the family, community, or society in which a child lives. Now, the second way that developmental trends vary is how they strictly or how strictly they are sequenced and hierarchical. In some view of development, changes are thought to happen in a specific order and to build on each other, sort of like a staircase model of development. For example, developmental psychologists and many of the rest of us might argue that young people must have tangible, hands-on experience with new materials before they can reason about the materials in the abstract form. Now, the order cannot be reversed. In other view of development, changes happen but not in a sequence or endpoint that is uniform. That sort of change is more like a kaleidoscope than a staircase. So a person who has permanent disability, for example, may experience complex long-term changes in personal values and priorities that are different both in timing and content from most people's developmental pathway. Now, when addressing teachers and other educators, educational psychologists have tended to emphasize explanations of development that are relatively general, universal, sequential rather than specific to particular cultures or that are not sequenced or kaleidoscopic. Such models, sometimes called grand theories, have the advantage of concisely integrating many features of development, while also describing the kind of people children or adolescents usually end up to be. Now, the preference for integrative perspectives makes sense given educators need to work with and teach a large number of diverse students both efficiently and effectively. But the approach also risks overgeneralizing or oversimplifying the experiences of particular children and youth. It can also confuse what does happen at a certain children, like the middle class ones, develop with what shouldn't happen to children. To understand this point, imagine two children of about the same age who have dramatically very different childhood experiences. For example, one grows up in poverty and another who grows up financially well off. In what sense can we say that these two children experience the same underlying developmental changes as they grow up? And how much should they even be expected to do so? Now, developmental psychology, and especially the broad theories of developmental psychology, highlight the sameness or common ground between these two children. As such, it serves as a counterpoint to knowledge of their obvious uniqueness and places their uniqueness in broader perspectives. So, physical development during the school years, although it may be tempting to think that physical development is the concern of physical education teachers only, it's actually a foundation for many academic tasks in the first grade, for example. It is important to know whether children can successfully manipulate a pencil. In latter grades, it's important to know how long students can be expected to sit still without discomfort, a real physical challenge, that is. In all grades, it is important to have a sense of students' health needs related to their age or maturity. If only to know who may become ill and with what illness, and to know what physical activities are reasonable and needed. So let's talk about a number of physical issues with regards to children and adolescents. Now, based on WHO data, typical height and weight for well-nourished children are shown here. So the figure shows average for several ages from preschool through the end of high school. But this table, if you think about it, does not show the diversity among children. At age 6, for example, when children begin school, the average boy or girl is about 115 centimeters tall. But some are 109 and others are 115 centimeters. Average weight at 6 is about 20 kilograms, but ranges between about 16 to 24 kilograms. About 20% variation in either direction. So because of this, there are points to keep in mind about average height and weight that are not evident from this table. So the first is that boys and girls on average are quite similar in height and weight during childhood, but diverge in the early teenage years when they reach puberty. For a time, approximately age 10 to 14, the average girl is taller. Remember the time when you had to dance, remember the time back in grade school when you have late grade school and early high school when you have to dance with an opposite sex. Remember how awkward it felt because girls are more taller than boys at that age, but actually not much heavier than the average boy. After that, the average boy becomes both taller and heavier than the average girl, though there remains individual exceptions. So the preteen differences can therefore be awkward for some children and youth, at least among those who aspire to looking like older teenagers or young adults. For young teens less concerned with image, though, the fact that girls are taller may not be especially important or even noticed. So a second point is that as children get older, individual differences in weight diverge more radically than differences in height. Among 18-year-old year olds, the heaviest youngsters weigh almost twice as much as the lightest. But the taller ones are only about 10% taller than the shortest. So nonetheless, both height and weight can be sensitive issues for some teenagers. Most modern societies and the teenagers in them tend to favor relatively short women and tall men, as well as somewhat thin body builds, especially for girls and women. Yet neither socially correct height or nor thinness is the density, or rather the destiny for many individuals. Being overweight in particular has become a common serious problem in modern society due to the prevalence of diets high in fat and lifestyle low in activity. So the educational system has unfortunately contributed to the problem as well by gradually restricting the number of physical education courses and classes in the past 2 decades. So the third point to keep in mind is that average height and weight is related somewhat to racial and ethnic background. In general, children from Asia, especially Southeast Asia, where we belong, uh, tend to be slightly shorter than children from, let's say, Europe and North American descent. So the latter, in turn, tend to be shorter than children from African societies. So body shape differs slightly as well, though the differences are not always visible until after puberty. Asian youths tend to have arms and legs that are a bit short relative to their torso, and African youth tend to have relatively longer arms and legs. So the difference are only averages. There are large individual differences as well, and these tend to be more relevant for teachers to know about than broad group differences. So, believe it or not, most self-assured adults you encounter were not always like that. Universal physical development in student is puberty, which is the set of changes in early adolescence that bring about sexual maturity along with internal changes in reproductive organs are outward changes such as growth of breast in girls and the penis in boys, as well as relatively sudden increase in height and weight. Now, by about age 10 or 12, most children experience increased sexual attraction to others, usually heterosexual, though not always, that affects social life both in school and out. By age 18, around 30% of boys and girls from the NCR report having sexual experience at least once, though it's hard to be certain of the proportion because of the sensitivity and the privacy of the information. At about the same time that puberty accentuates gender, role differences also accentuate for at least some teenagers. Some girls who excelled at math or science in elementary school may curb their enthusiasm and display of success at these subjects for fear of limiting their popularity or attractiveness as girls. Some boys who were not especially interested in sports previously may begin dedicating themselves to athletics to affirm their masculinity in the eyes of others. Some boys and girls who once worked together successfully on class projects may no longer feel comfortable doing so, or alternatively, may now seek to be working partners, but for social rather than academic reasons. Such changes do not affect all youngsters equally, nor affect any one youngster equally on all social occasions. An individual student may act like a young adult on one day, but more like a child the next. When teaching children who are experiencing puberty, teachers need to respond flexibly and supportively. So, students' fundamental motor skills are already developing when they begin kindergarten, but are not yet perfectly coordinated. 5 years old generally can walk satisfactorily for most school-related purposes. If they could not, schools would have to be organized very differently. For some fives, running still look a bit like a hurried walk, but usually it becomes more coordinated within a year or two. Similarly, with jumping, throwing, and catching, most children can do these things, though often clumsy. By the time they start school, but improve their skills noticeably during the early elementary years. Now, assisting such development is usually the job either of physical education teachers where they exist, or else of classroom teachers during designated physical education activities. Whoever is responsible, it is important to notice if a child does not keep more or less the usual developmental timetable, and to arrange for special assessment or support if appropriate. So even if physical skills are not a special focus of a classroom teacher, they can be quite important to students themselves. Whatever their grade level, students who are clumsy, like me, are aware of the fact and how it could potentially negatively affect respect from their peers. In the long term, self-consciousness and poor self-esteem can develop for a child who is clumsy, or a child whose parents or adults or other adults tell them that they are clumsy, especially if peers or teachers and parents place high value on success in athletics. One research found, for example, what teachers and coaches sometimes suspect, that losers in athletic competitions tend to become less sociable and are more apt to be subsequent athletic practicers than winners. So, by world standards, children and youth in economically developed societies tend on average to be remarkably healthy. Even so, much depends on precisely how well off families are and on how much healthy care is available to them. Children from higher income families, that is, experience far fewer serious or life-threatening illness than children from low-income families. Whatever their income level, parents and teachers often rightly notes that children, especially the youngest ones, get far more illnesses than do adults. In 2004, for example, a US government survey estimated that children get an average of 6 to 10 colds per year, but adults get only about 2 to 4 per year. So the difference probably exists because children's immune system are not yet as fully formed as adults. And because children at school are continually exposed to other children, many of whom may be contagious themselves. An indirect result of children's frequent illness is that teachers, along with airline flight attendants, incidentally, also report more frequent minor illnesses than do adults in general. About 5 colds per year, for example, instead of just 2 to 4. So these simple illnesses are not life-threatening, but they are responsible for many lost days in schools, both for teachers and students, as well as days when a student may be present physically but functions below par while simultaneously infecting other kids. In these ways, learning and teaching often suffer because health is suffering. So the problem is not only that the prevalence of illnesses as such, but the fact that illness are not distributed uniformly among students, schools, or communities. Whether it is simple cold or something more serious like COVID, illness is particularly common where living conditions are crowded, where healthcare is scarce or unaffordable, and where individuals live with frequent stress of any kind. Often, but not always, these are the circumstances of poverty. The table here summarizes these effects for a variety of health problems, not just for colds or flu. So, as students get older, illnesses become less frequent, but other health risks emerge. The most widespread is the consumption of alcohol and the smoking of cigarette or even vape. As of 2004, about 75% of teenagers in the NCR reported drinking an alcoholic beverage at least occasionally, and 22% reported smoking cigarette. The good news is that these proportions show a small but steady decline in the frequencies over the past 10 years or so. The bad news is that teenagers also show increase in the abuse of some prescription drugs such as inhalants that act as stimulants. So, as with the prevalence of illnesses, the prevalence of drug use is not uniform, with a relatively small fraction of individuals accounting for disproportionate proportion of usage. One survey, for example, found that a teenager was 3 to 5 times more likely to smoke or use alcohol or use drug if he or she has a sibling who has also indulged in these habits. Siblings, it seems, are more influential in this case than parents. So now let's talk about cognitive development. Now, cognition refers to thinking and memory processes, and cognitive development refers to long-term changes in these processes. One of the most widely known perspective about cognitive development is the cognitive stage theory of a Swiss psychologist named Jean Piaget, which we have talked about briefly last week. Piaget created and studied an account of how children and youth gradually become able to think logically and scientifically. Because his theory is especially popular among educators, we will focus on this we will focus on it on this part of the lesson. As we have talked about last week, Piaget was a psychological constructivist. In his view, learning proceeds by the interplay of assimilation, that is, adjusting new experiences to fit prior concepts, and accommodation, adjusting concepts to fit new experiences. So, the to and fro of these two processes lead not only to short-term learning but also to long-term developmental changes. The long-term developments are really the main focus of Piaget's cognitive theory. So, after observing children closely, Piaget proposed that cognition developed through distinct stages from birth through the end of adolescence. So, by stages, he meant a sequence of thinking patterns with 4 key features. First is that developmental changes always happen in the same order. No stage is the second is that no stage is ever skipped. The third is that each stage is a significant transformation of the stage before it. And fourth is that each later stage incorporate the earlier stages in itself. So basically, This is the staircase method of development we mentioned earlier. So Piaget proposed four major stages in cognitive development, and he called them: number one, sensory intelligence; number two, pre-operational thinking; number three, right here, concrete operational thinking; and number four, right here, formal operational thinking. So each stage is correlated with an age period of childhood, but not approximately. So let's talk about these four stages by starting with the sensory motor stage. So the sensory motor stage, which occurs from birth to age 2, Piaget, or rather in Piaget's theory, the sensory motor stage is first and is defined as the period when infants think by means of their senses and motor actions. So, as every new parent will attest, infants continually touch, manipulate, look, listen, and even bite and chew objects. According to Piaget, these actions allow them to learn about the world and are crucial to their early childhood or cognitive development. Now, the infant's action allow the child to represent or construct simple concepts of objects and events. A toy animal may be just a confusing array of sensation at first, but by looking, feeling, and manipulating it repeatedly, the child gradually organizes her sensation and action into a stable concept, toy animal. So, the representation acquires a permanence lacking in the individual experience of objects, which are constantly changing. So, because the representation is stable, the child knows or at least believes that toy animal exists even if that actual toy animal is temporarily out of sight. Piaget called this sense of stability object permanence, a belief that objects exist whether or not they are actually present. So it's a major achievement of sensory motor development and marks a qualitative transformation in how older infants, about 24 months, think about experiences compared to younger infants, about 6 months. So during much of infancy, of course, a child can only barely talk. So sensory motor development initially happens without the support of language. It might therefore seem hard to know what infants are thinking, but Piaget devised several simple but clever experiments to get around the lack of language. And that suggests that infants do indeed represent objects even without being able to talk. For example, he simply hid an object like a toy animal under a blanket, and then he found that doing so consistently prompts older infants, about 18 to 24 months, to search for the said object, but fails to prompt younger infants less than 6 months old to do so. So you can try this experiment yourself if you happen to have an access to young infant. This means that something motivates the search by the older infants even without the benefit of much language. And something is presumed to be permanent or a permanent concept of representation of the object. So the second stage is the pre-operational stage, which happens from 2 to 7 years old. So in the pre-operational stage, children use their new ability to represent objects in a wide variety of activities, but they do not yet do it in ways that are organized or fully logical. One of the most obvious examples of this kind of cognition is dramatic play. So, the improvised make-believe of preschool children. So, if you have ever had responsibility for children of any, or rather of this age, you have likely witnessed such play. Uh, For example, a child named Ashley might hold a plastic banana to her ear and say, "Hello, mom. Can you be sure to bring me my baby doll?" Okay. So when then she hangs up the banana and pours tea for Jeremy, let's say, into an invisible cup. So Jeremy giggles at the sight of all this and exclaims, "Oh, Ashley, the phone is ringing again. You better answer it," and it goes on. So, in a way, children immersed in make-believe seems mentally insane, right? In that way, in that they do not think realistically. But they are not truly insane because they have not really taken leave of their senses. At some level, Ashley and Jeremy, in our example earlier, always know that the banana is still a banana and not really a telephone. They are merely representing it as a telephone. So they are thinking on two levels at once, one imaginative and the other realistic. So this dual processing of experience makes dramatic play an early example of metacognition, or reflecting on and monitoring of thinking itself. So metacognition is a highly desirable skill for success in school. Uh, One that teacher often encourages. So partly for this reason, teachers of young children, preschool, kindergarten, and even first or second grade, often make time and space in their classroom for dramatic play, and sometimes even participate in it themselves to help develop the play further. So the third is the concrete operational stage. And this happens between the ages 7 to 11. So as children continue to into elementary school, they become able to represent ideas and events more flexibly and logically. So their rules of thinking is still, or rather still seem very basic by adult standard and usually operate unconsciously, but they allow children to solve problems more systematically than before, and therefore be successful with many academic tasks. So in the concrete operational stage, for example, a child may unconsciously follow the rule, if nothing is added or taken away, then the amount of something stays the same. So this simple principle helps children to understand certain arithmetic tasks, such as in adding or subtracting zero from a number, as well as to do certain classroom science experiments, such as ones involving judgments of the amount of liquids when mixed. So Piaget called this period the concrete operational stage because children's mentally operate on concrete objects and events. So they are not yet able, however, to operate or think systematically about representations of objects or events. So manipulating representations is a more abstract skill that develops later on during adolescence. So concrete operational thinking differs from pre-operational thinking in two ways. You might actually be confused. What are the differences between these two stages? So each of which renders children more skilled as students. One difference is reversibility, or the ability to think about the steps of a process in order. Imagine a simple science experiment, for example, such as one that explores why objects sink or float by having a child place an assortment of objects in a basin of water. So both the pre-operational and concrete operational child can recall and describe the steps in these experiments, but only the concrete operational child can recall them in any order. So this skill is very helpful on any task involving multiple steps, which is a common feature of so many tasks in the classroom. So in teaching new vocabulary from a story, for example, a teacher might tell students, first, make a list of words in the story that you do not know, then find and write down their definition, and finally, get a friend to test you on your list. So this directions involve repeatedly remembering to move back and forth between a second and the first step. So a task that concrete operational students and most adults find easy, but that pre-operational children often forgot to do or find confusing. So if the younger children are to do this task reliably, they may need external prompts. So, such as having a teacher remind them periodically to go back and forth to the story to look for more unknown words. So, the other new feature of thinking during the concrete operational stage is the child's ability to decenter or focus on more than one feature of the problem at a time. So, there are hints of the centration in preschool children's dramatic play, which requires being aware on two levels at once, knowing that, for example, our example earlier, that a banana can be both a banana and a telephone. But the centration on the concrete operational stage is more deliberate and conscious than preschool make-believe. So now the child can attend to two things at once quite purposely. So suppose you give children a sheet with an assortment of subtraction problem on it and ask them to do this. Find all the problems that involve two-digit subtraction and that involve borrowing from the next column. So circle and solve only those problems. So following these instructions is quite possible for a concrete operational student as long as they have been listening because the student can attend to subtasks simultaneously, finding the two-digit problems and identifying which actually involves borrowing. So whether the student actually knows how to borrow, however, is actually a separate question. So in real classroom tasks, reversibility and decentration often happens together. So a well-known example of joint presence is Piaget's experiment with conservation, or the belief that an amount of or quantity stays the same even if it changes apparent shape or size or even appearance. So imagine two identical balls made of clay. Any child, whether pre-operational or concrete operational, will agree that the two indeed have the same amount of clay in them simply because they look the same. But if you now squish one ball into a long, thin hot dog, the pre-operational child is likely to say that the amount of that ball has changed, either because it's longer or because it's thinner. But at any rate, because it now looks different. So the concrete operational child will not make the same mistake. So thanks to a new cognitive skill of reversibility and decentration, for him or her, the amount is the same because you could squish it back into a ball again. That's reversibility. And because it may be longer, but it's actually thinner, which is decentration. So Piaget would say that a concrete operational child has conservation of quantity. So the classroom examples, which I described earlier, also involve reversibility and decentration. As already mentioned, the vocabulary activity described earlier requires reversibility, going back and forth between identifying words and looking up their meanings. But it can also be construed as an example of decentration, like keeping in mind two tasks at once: word identification and dictionary searches. And as mentioned, the arithmetic activity requires decentration, looking for problems that meet two criteria and also solving them. But it can also be construed as an example of reversibility, going back and forth between subtasks and with vocabulary, as with the vocabulary activity. Either way, the development of concrete operational skill supports students in doing many basic academic tasks. In any sense, they make ordinary schoolwork possible. Lastly, let's talk about the formal operational stage. So, in the last Piaget stage, the child becomes able to reason not only about tangible objects and events, but also about hypothetical or abstract ones. Hence, it has the name formal operational stage, the period when the individual can operate on forms or representations. With a student at this level, the teacher can pose hypothetical or contrary to fact problems. What if the world had never discovered oil, or what if the first Europeans had settled first in California instead of the East Coast on United States, or what if the martial law did not happen? So, to answer such questions, students must use hypothetical reasoning, meaning that they must manipulate ideas that vary in several ways at once and do so entirely in their minds. So the hypothetical reasoning that concerned Piaget primarily involved scientific problems. His studies of formal operational thinking therefore often looks like problems that middle or high school teachers pose in science classes. In one problem, for example, a young person is presented with a simple pendulum to which different amounts of weight can be hung. So the experimenter asks what determines how fast the pendulum swings. So the length of the string holds the holding it, the weight attached to it, or the distance that it is pulled to the side. So the young person is not allowed to solve the problem by trial and error with the materials themselves, but must reason a way to the solution mentally. So to do so systematically, he or she must imagine varying each factor separately, while also imagining other factors that are held constant. So this kind of thinking requires facility at manipulating mental representations of the relevant object and actions. Precisely the skills that define formal operations. So as you might suspect, students with an ability to think hypothetically have an advantage in many kinds of schoolwork. By definition, they require relatively few props to solve problems. In this sense, they can, in principle, be more self-directed than students who rely on concrete cooperations. Certainly a desirable quality in the opinion of most teachers, myself included. Note though that formal operational thinking is desirable but not sufficient for school success, and that it's far from being only way that students achieve educational success. So formal thinking skills do not ensure that a student is motivated or well-behaved, for example, nor does it guarantee other desirable skills such as ability at sports, music, art. And the fourth stage in Piaget's theory is really about a particular kind of formal thinking, the kind needed to solve scientific problems and devise scientific experiments. Since many people do not normally deal with such problems in the normal course of their lives, it should be no surprise that research find that many people never achieve or use formal thinking fully or consistently, or that they use it only in selected areas in which they are very familiar. For teachers, that limitation suggests a need for additional theories about development. Ones that focus more directly on the social and interpersonal issues of childhood and adolescence, which is the topic for the next video of this lesson. So, this ends the first part of our lesson in student development. My name is Dex Kamitan and this is Ellie. Thank you for watching.